Thanks, Tom. This is not my first visit to Canberra, but it is my first address, not to, but at the National Press Club. I start with a celebration, but I end on a note of controversy. The 2004 election, like the 2001 election, saw the coalition return to office with both an increased share of the vote and an increased share of the seats. Doing both was something no other Prime Minister and only one other government had done in successive elections since Federation, the other government being the Menzies government in '63 and the Holt government of '66. For the first time since 1977, the coalition also secured a majority in the Senate, a possibility Graham Richardson noted ruefully, which had fallen beneath every expert pundit's radar. Early in 2004, there were times when Labor's lead in the opinion polls was, as Thomas said, of landslide proportions. As opposition leader, Latham may have lifted Labor from the depths to which it had sunk under his predecessor Simon Crean and made it competitive again, but in October, Latham would become the first opposition leader since the war to have led the opposition for the first time and to have seen the opposition's vote go backwards. When Howard called the election, the coalition was trailing Labor 46-54 in Newspoll, 47-53 in the AC Nielsen poll, and 44-56 in the Morgan poll. Only in the Galaxy poll, a poll yet to establish a track record, were the two sides level pegging. Once the election was called, there was a shift across almost all the polls to the coalition. Whereas most of the pre-campaign polls had the coalition well behind when Howard called the election, in the first 3 weeks of the campaign, the first half of the campaign that encompassed the Bali bombings and the leaders' debate, the polls on average had the coalition and Labor tied 50-50. On the pendulum, Labor needed to win 51.3% of the two-party preferred if it was to secure a majority government, or 50.8% if it were to form a minority government. So at 50-50, Latham was in a worse position than Howard. In week 4, after Labor pledged to redistribute funds from wealthy private schools to poorer private schools, the coalition established a lead of roughly 51-49. In week 5, after the party's official campaign launches, Howard's $30 million a minute spending spree, as someone called it, and Labor's proposal to introduce Medicare Gold for the over 75s, the coalition's lead appears to have edged up to around 51.5 to 48.5. And in week 6, the final week, after Latham announced Labor's forest policy, but before Howard announced his, the coalition's position appears to have improved still further to around 52-48, not far short of the election result of 52.7 to 47.3. But the policy drivers of the coalition's success were not education, nor health, nor was the contrast between the coalition's policy on forests and Labor's policy on forests critical. The issues that defeated Labor, judging by the data from the Australian Election Study, were economic management, especially managing interest rates, terrorism and defence, but not the war in Iraq, and, of course, immigration. The leadership contest may also have contributed. Before the election, the polls had Howard leading Latham as preferred Prime Minister by between 8 and 11 percentage points. In the last polls of the campaign, Howard led Latham by between 14 and 17 percentage points. Let us look more closely at the issues, then at the leadership question, and conclude with some thoughts about other things which might bear on the question of whether the campaign mattered. This election will be about trust, Howard told journalists when he called the election. To reprise, Tom, who do you trust to keep the economy strong and protect family living standards? Who do you trust to keep interest rates low? Who do you trust to lead the fight on Australia's behalf against international terrorism? Who do you trust to keep the budget strong so that we can afford to spend on health and education? When he called the election, business investment, commodity prices and building approvals were rising, as were average earnings. Unemployment was falling. Inflation was within the RBA's target range. Some 60% of respondents polled by Labor thought the country was headed in the right direction, mainly due to its economic strength. On the other hand, the growth in GDP was slowing. And although the sharp rise in housing prices since the mid-1990s had stalled, interest rates were rising, as was household debt. The state of the economy wasn't the only thing to help build the coalition's credentials as an economic manager. Labor's lack of credibility helped as well. Ahead of the election, AC Nielsen reported a gap of 35 percentage points between the proportion who thought Labor and the proportion who thought the coalition would handle the economy better. After the election, in the Liberals' research, the coalition led Labor as the party best able to keep the economy strong by a massive 49 percentage points. The Liberals' attempt to leverage economic security involved talking up their own performance in delivering, emphasising the risk of putting a learner like Latham, a leader with an L plate, in charge of taxing, spending and borrowing, and rehearsing the history of interest rate increases under Labor. In the fourth week of the campaign, Annabel Crabb reports when Howard suddenly turned to regional security, Mark texted a warning that unless the interest rates tax was restored within days, the government would be in real trouble. 3 days before the election, in Labor's research, the majority of swinging voters agreed with the proposition that even though I think it's time for a change, I can't take even the smallest risk of interest rates going up. The growing unease that Labor was a threat to low interest rates is something Labor heard during the campaign, from candidates with strong links to their communities, from unionists talking to members in workplaces, and from our own research, said Tim Gartrell, Labor's campaign director. It was the interest rate election, said George Megalogenis. The geography of the vote appears to bear this out. Seats with the highest proportion of mortgages were generally those which recorded the biggest swings against the ALP. However, according to Ian McAllister and Clive Bean, the main organisers of the Australian election study, interest rates counted for nothing. Not according to my analysis of the same data. On the contrary, Ian Watson and I found that interest rates correlated more closely than any other issue among respondents in that study. The interest rate issue ticked 3 important boxes. First, it most clearly divided coalition from Labor respondents. 61% of coalition respondents compared with 42% of Labor respondents rated it extremely important. Second, when respondents were asked which party's position on interest rates was closest to their own, 46% of coalition respondents compared with just 17% of Labor respondents nominated their own party's position, a gap unmatched in relation to any other issue. Third, among respondents who rated interest rates extremely important, the probability of voting for the coalition was 24 percentage points higher, all other things equal, than the probability of voting Labor. No other issue matched this. In what sense the economy mattered is more difficult to say. McAllister argues that voters are motivated by evaluations of the national economy rather than by evaluations of their own economic circumstances. But the evidence is mixed. Likewise, for his argument that voters are more likely to be focused on the economic past than on the economic future. In 2004, judgments that the country's economic circumstances had improved, would improve, or would get worse were related to how respondents voted. Judgments that the country's economic circumstances had worsened were not. Judgments that one's household circumstances had improved were not related to how respondents voted. Judgments that one's household circumstances had worsened were, and of course, predicted a Labor vote. What about health and education? Howard wanted an election fought on policies that would give us better health and education, as he said, but health and education, as Thomas noted, were not coalition strengths. In the election study, respondents who regarded either health or education as extremely important were likely to vote for Labor rather than the coalition. Following its pledge to introduce Medicare Gold, Labor's first preferences among respondents aged 50 or more increased by 3 percentage points. Its two-party preferred by 7 percentage points, according to Labor's research. And not only in Labor's research, in the Liberals' research too, Medicare Gold sent the coalition support backwards. Nor was Labor's advantage on education destroyed by the coalition's attempt to frame it as class warfare. Labor's research showed that its school policy was its best vote switcher, said Latham. In the election study, the environment was another issue on which the coalition trailed Labor. Had the study asked about old growth forests rather than the environment, would the figures have been different? Early in the campaign, Howard had declared that while everybody would like to see old growth logging stopped, he would not throw regional communities on the scrap heap in order to achieve a particular environmental objective. At that stage, he was keen to win mainland seats in green-tinged marginal city electorates and keen to win the preferences of green-tinged voters further afield. At the beginning of the last week of the campaign, Latham visited Tasmania to announce that Labor would protect the overwhelming majority of its old-growth forests, and he pledged $800 million to retrain workers whose jobs would be lost. 2 days later, at an overflow meeting attended by hundreds, if not quite 1,500, forestry workers in Launceston's Albert Hall, Howard announced that the coalition would allow logging with limited conservation and protect existing jobs. How much of the coalition's electoral success can be attributed to either Howard's pledge or Latham's announcement? Less perhaps than many assessments suggests. In a poll published weeks earlier in the Launceston Examiner, the Liberals were already well ahead in both Braddon and Bass, the 2 seats they went on to win, ostensibly because of the forest policy. We should also note that the swing to the coalition in Tasmania was not very different to the swing to it in Western Australia or Victoria. If the contest over forest policy hit the campaign with a force that few had foreseen, that the war in Iraq failed to make the impact that many had anticipated. In March, Latham had committed Labor to bringing the troops home by Christmas, as Tom has noted. Immediately afterwards, George Megaloganis said Labor's lead in the polls vanished. It didn't. Labor led two-party preferred from the beginning of March to the end of August in the fortnightly news poll, falling behind in just one poll out of 13 and finishing on even terms in another. It led every month in the AC Nielsen poll. In the Morgan poll, it never fell behind. Iraq proved to be a substantial liability, not for Labor, but for the coalition. In the election studies, respondents were more likely to strongly disapprove the way John Howard handled the war in Iraq than to strongly approve it. And among those who thought the issue extremely important, the chance of voting for the coalition over Labor declined by 26 percentage points. Though the war in Iraq appeared to work for Labor, terrorism continued to work for the coalition. After the bombing of the Australian Embassy in Jakarta during the second week of the campaign, Labor's polling showed that concerns about defence and terrorism tripled, and the coalition established its first substantive lead on the key question, does it deserve to win the election? The effect of the bombing, however, was short-lived. A few days after the leaders' debate, support for Labor and its leader returned to pre-Jakarta levels. Still, terrorism as an issue had not been neutralised. In the election study, half the respondents said terrorism was extremely important to the way they had voted, and among these respondents, the chance of voting for the coalition was 19% greater than the chances of voting Labor. Immigration as an issue, though not as important as it had been in 2001, appears to have worked for the coalition as well. Of the 30% who thought it extremely important, the probability of voting for the coalition was 11 percentage points greater. This may help to explain the success the coalition enjoyed in attracting most of the Hanson vote it hadn't won at the last election in 2001. What about leadership? Howard's decision to frame the election as a contest around trust was greeted by some with complete disbelief. Credibility and truth were the Prime Minister's Achilles heel, Labor's pollster was said to have told the party. What the pollster failed to add, I suspect, was that the vulnerability of his heel, according to legend, was left Achilles invulnerable everywhere else. What did the public think about the trustworthiness of Howard and of Latham, and what about their other qualities? In mid-September, in the last of a series of polls on the qualities of the two leaders, news polls showed Howard trailing Latham on trustworthiness by 51 to 61, and on other positives, in touch with the voters, caring for people, and likeable. But it showed Howard ahead of Latham on decisive and strong. More importantly, Newspoll had Howard well ahead of Latham on his ability to manage national security, 50 to 31, and on his ability to manage the economy by an extraordinary 34 percentage points. In the last of the polls of the campaign, Howard had the edge on Latham as preferred Prime Minister by about 16 percentage points. In the election, support for the party split 46.4 to 37.6 on first preferences, a difference of 9 percentage points. So support for Howard as preferred Prime Minister was about 7 percentage points ahead of support for the coalition over Labor. Support for Howard was about 7 percentage points ahead of support for the coalition itself, and support for Latham was about the same as support for Labor. On these figures, Howard may have lifted the coalition vote a little, but it's doubtful that Latham could have depressed the Labor vote by very much. Bean and McAllister conclude from the election study that respondents who strongly liked Howard were 25% more likely to vote for the LNP, while those strongly in favour of Latham were only 15% more likely to vote for Labor. But they don't tell us what proportion of respondents strongly liked either Howard or Latham. If the proportion at the extreme end of the distribution was small, the effect on the vote overall would have to have been small. In any event, their findings rest on a study that fails to include any of the descriptors, competence and integrity most notably, that other studies suggest are the ones that really count, and rest on a study that ignores all the negative descriptors that voters used, especially in relation to Latham, erratic, propensity to blame others, inexperienced, and so on, which came up quite frequently in the party research. In the final week of the campaign, insiders on both sides could feel momentum shifting Howard's way, Wayne Errington and Peter Van Onselen report. But on the evidence of the published polls, the momentum had shifted well before then. It had shifted the moment the election was called, quite dramatically I think, and with a few bumps along the way, it continued to shift towards the coalition. Voters who made up their mind during the campaign were almost twice as likely to have voted Labor in the end than voted for the coalition. The same appears to be true of those who finally made up their mind during the week, the last week. This can be read as suggesting that there were a lot more Labor voters thinking of swinging to the coalition than there were coalition voters contemplating a switch to Labor. The polls may have underestimated the size of the government's lead, but on this evidence, the government didn't enjoy a huge late swing. It follows that the claim that Howard's forest policy was the straw that broke Labor's back, as one political scientist has put it, is far-fetched. Ditto for those that think Latham's famous handshake with Howard on election eve outside a radio studio might have been decisive. Completely implausible. Some final observations. Howard believes that his battlers were socially conservative, but whether the party's conservative positions on social issues added to its success is something the election study doesn't allow us to explore. Howard's battlers also took pride, he says, in what he calls the Australian achievement, a reference, one imagines, to Anzac as a defining moment in nationhood and the rejection of the black armband view of Australian history. Here again, the election study is of no help. Absent too from the election study are questions about party images. Those automatic associations with a party, as the political psychologist Graham Wallace described them 100 years ago, that need to be as clear as possible, shared by as large a number as possible, and able to call up as many and as strong emotions as possible. Brian Loughnane, the Liberal Party's director, noted that after Labor had spent more than 8 years in opposition, Australians still did not know what Labor stood for. By contrast, he said there was a clear, defined message about what the government stood for, reinforced by policy promises consistent with what the government stood for. Party images aren't moulded in a matter of weeks or dismantled in a matter of days. You can't fatten a pig on market day, as John Carrick, Howard's mentor, never tired of saying from 1949 until the day he died. I think the election was a done deal some 6 months out, said former Labor Minister and political scientist Neil Blewett. Hugh Mackay spoke in similar terms. Voters do not change their mind in response to the thrust and parry of an election campaign. They make quiet judgments in the months or even years that precede it. For Mackay, the election was always going to be about the economy and national security, and Labor, he said, never got on the community's radar on either issue. On election night, Howard singled out the Galaxy poll for having been the most reliable of the campaign. Galaxy was the only poll that had the coalition ahead at the beginning, at the middle of the campaign, and at the end. If the coalition led all the way, it's difficult to say that it was the campaign what done it. Thank you.
So, Murray, can you help us understand, was the election result in any way influenced by the individual performances of Brian Loughnane and Tim Gartrell? And what about internal polling of the parties? How did they perform?
One of the striking things about Australian elections, with the exception of 1998, is how well the Mackerras or green pendulum works. Not in the sense of picking out exactly which seats will swing, or lost or gained on a particular national swing, but in terms of showing us how many seats net will be won by the party that wins and lost by the party that loses. In this election, I think the pendulum was out by 1, which is pretty good. Obviously, the coalition won a number of seats. They also lost a number of seats, and the balance was clearly in their favour. And the difference between what you would have expected on national swing and what they got, I think, was about 1. Now, that's an indirect way, and obtuse way perhaps, of coming to your question about Loughnane and Gartrell. If one or the other campaign was clearly the dominant one, you'd expect it to show up in seats won against the pendulum, as it were. If the outstanding campaigners were the Liberals, they should have won more seats against the pendulum, as they did in 1998, and they didn't. If Gartrell had been, and Gartrell's team had been clearly an inferior outfit, they should have lost more seats than the pendulum predicted, and they didn't. So my rough sense is that the work of both sides cancelled each other out.
Thank you. Please, your questions. If you'd like to raise your hand, wait till the microphone comes to you, let us know who you are, and then please ask your question. And the first question from the Honourable Michael Danby.
Can you explore just a little bit more the effect of Mark Latham's announcement of change of funding of private schools during the election? Did you say that had no effect, a big effect? Did it affect the parents who were enrolled in private schools and Catholic schools?
I can't tell you about particular demographic groups. What I can say is that, so far as I know, it came out as a plus in Labor research, and my indications are that it didn't make much difference to it came out as a plus in Labor research, didn't make much difference to Liberal research. And the overriding impression I get looking at the published polls and the trends in the published polls is that whereas there may have been evening to evening bumps in the party's research, and the parties, as some people may not know, track every night pretty well during the campaign. They get very excited in the marginal seats that they track about movements, and they try to relate these back to events that have happened in the day. Sometimes these shifts are quite substantial, and other times they're not. But if you map these shifts, these bumps as I call them, against the changes, the trends in the national polls, what you see is that, yes, there were moments when things shifted to the Labor side, I think over Medicare, maybe and to much less extent education, to the coalition side over the Bali bombings and terrorism threats and so on. But gradually, there was an increase in support for the coalition. You smooth out these bumps over the course of the campaign from about the midpoint, weeks 4, 5 and 6, and I think quite a big jump in support once the election was announced and people actually began to focus on the contest.
So, Murray, events like this handshake,
Yes.
their colour, their movement, their light, but they don't change people's votes. In other words, when Brian Loughnane says, oh, the switchboard lit up, it might have lit up, but it was with people who'd already worked out what they thought, not that that was going to cause them to change their vote.
That's right. We're not sure whether it was Liberal voters saying this is just what we thought, or people that had already switched. There may be an analogy going back to 1975 in those huge rallies that greeted Gough Whitlam as he campaigned to right the wrong of his dismissal. And some people interpreted these huge turnout as a sign that, Gough was on the way back. Well, there was no such thing. And it may be that people that are the sort of people that contact Brian Loughnane are not necessarily indicative of a wider public. It's difficult to imagine this did the Labor cause any good at all, and there may have been some movement. There was, as I said, I mean, the polls did underestimate by what, half a percentage points, which is quite a number of votes, the support for the coalition that the coalition finally got, and maybe some of that indeed came from there. But my view is that by the time the Liberal Party finished its polling on Wednesday night, well before the Friday night handshake, this election was well and truly in the bag, and I can't discover anyone who seriously doubts that.
And episodes like the one-day Senate inquiry prompted by Mike Scrafton's letter in The Australian, is there any evidence that it ever made any impression to the vote?
No, there's no evidence that it made any impression. There's no evidence that it made no impression. It's just too small a thing for anyone to have picked up. But the notion that the Australian public is focused on events in the Senate, not even one's first-year politics class has a majority of students focused on the Senate, and possibly doesn't have a majority that even knows the Senate exists.
Well, as we acknowledge the selfless service of all those senators through time and space, the Honourable Gary Nairn.
Sorry. What analysis have you done regarding pre-poll voting as opposed to on the day? And I appreciate that a pre-poll vote, you don't know whether it's lodged 3 weeks before or 1 day before. However, there is trends, so the effect to get some sort of picture of the changing aspect that occurred in voting in the lead up to the election via the pre-poll.
I've done none. I know of none. That's not to say there isn't stuff, but of course pre-polls now are a very different. Pre-polls now are a very different beast to pre-polls in 2004. It's now a very big deal. It may have been in some seats a big deal in 2004, but it would have been very few seats, and I know no work on it.
So I can't let you go, though, without just probing you on one thing. So my friend Jerry Wheeler put to me that this 2000 campaign made a difference, and you've put a view on that. For it to have made a difference, what kinds of things would have made a difference?
What could Labor have done to win the election?
Well, was it a case of if it's true that oppositions don't win, governments lose, what could Labor have done? And if there was an opportunity for the coalition to further extend its majority, where might it have targeted some of its campaigning? Because campaigning costs a lot of money, involving a lot of people. You're putting to us that it's had marginal influence, and yet a lot of people spending a lot of time to achieve not a great deal.
Yes, I think that's right. I think that's that's the great paradox of the pendulum. The pendulum was created in 1972 to help commentators and help people running election campaigns direct their resources to the seat that mattered. But the whole argument of the pendulum was that you could read off the result from a national figure. This is the paradox of the pendulum, which people didn't catch on to, so that political campaigners took the marginal seats to be the one they ought to be going after. Although the argument, Mackerras's argument, basically was you can read off the result, and he was correct about that, broadly speaking, you can read off the result from a national two-party preferred figure. And what I'm saying is, yes, you could use these data, this list, to target seats and better target seats, put more resources in. And this might work if the other side didn't do the same thing.
So is it simply a case, if one side does something, the other side doesn't do anything, then there's a net gain to them? Essentially, are you saying that these campaigns cancel each other out? They have to exist because the other will mount one, but they essentially count each other. And why not just focus on Eden Monero because of its particular standing in the Why not just focus on that, do nothing else anywhere, see if it works in Eden Monero, and bugger the rest?
Yes, well, you could run an experiment. I haven't advised either party to do it because I know they would show me the door pretty quickly. And as a campaign director, I'm not sure I take my own advice. That's to say, you could say, let's have an experiment. Let's not campaign in a seat. We could actually have an arrangement. You Labor campaign in these 3 seats and we won't, and we'll campaign in these 3 seats and you don't, and let's see what happens. Now, David Butler's view is that nothing would happen, that the campaigns in the marginal seats are a waste of time. My view is much more moderate than David Butler's, that what's more likely is that the 2 campaigns cancel each other out. But it's possible Butler's right. Do we allow this one?
Former member for Bennelong. This is where I interpose by saying Rodney Cavalier has also put the view that a good local member almost makes no difference.
Yeah, well, I've held that view for a long time. But is that right? Yeah, fine. Murray, I don't think I'm giving any trade secrets away to say that one of the interesting things to me about 2004 campaign was that immediately the Liberal Party started its tracking research at the beginning of the campaign. We had very clear leads in our marginal seats in Western Australia, Queensland and New South Wales, but the Victorian marginals were extremely equivocal and remained so until we stopped our marginal seat polling on the Wednesday night.
Okay.
I mean, seats like Herbert and Canning and Robertson,
Right.
we had, from the get-go, we were in a good shape, but in seats like La Trobe and Casey and others, a different picture. Do you have any explanation for that?
No, I don't. One of the nice things about the pendulum, it says, well, you'll do badly in Queensland, but you'll pick up seats in, Victoria or whatever. So it's not just marginal seats where, you lose some that you might expect to win and win some you thought you would lose, but that...
We didn't lose the Victorian seats.
No, in the end it didn't. But you did do not as well in some seats as you might have done, and you did better in other seats and so on. And sometimes these are not a question of individual seats; they're often related to swings that are statewide. So again, if you're asking me about what drives electoral behaviour, I would think firstly of national forces, and secondly of regional or state forces, and only third, the very local forces.
I always benefit from listening to Murray. There are things that I'd never thought, questions I'd never thought about to ask, let dare so do so. We always benefit from, at these conferences, a hearing from Murray. Would you please join with me in thanking him this morning?